The year was 1873, and in the silver mines of Virginia City, Nevada, death didn't announce itself with a warning. It came in silence, in darkness, and most often in the moment a man realized the mountain had stopped forgiving his greed. Jacob Stone understood this better than anyone, because he had already died once, 5 years ago, in an explosion that took his hearing but left him with something far more dangerous: the ability to work with death itself and never hear it coming. Deep in the bowels of the Vandermeer silver mine, 800 feet below the surface, where the air was thick enough to chew and the heat could cook a man from the inside out, Jacob Stone knelt before a wooden crate that would make most men's hands shake with terror. Inside, cushioned by sawdust and soaked rags, sat 12 glass bottles of pure nitroglycerin, each one capable of vaporizing everything within a 50-foot radius if disturbed by so much as a harsh word. But Jacob couldn't hear words anymore, harsh or otherwise. Before we descend any further into this darkness, I need to know if you're ready to follow this story to its explosive conclusion. If you want to witness how silence became the most powerful weapon in the American West, subscribe now and stay until the final detonation. On a scale of 0 to 10, how much does a story of calculated revenge against industrial greed resonate with you? Comment below, because every voice matters, even the ones that can't be heard. Now let us return to the mountain and the man who was about to discover that someone had already found his secret. Jacob's fingers moved across the glass surface of the nitroglycerin bottles with the gentle precision of a man reading Braille on the skin of a sleeping serpent. He couldn't hear the constant drip of groundwater echoing through the shaft, couldn't hear the ominous creaking of the timber supports, but he could feel something else, a vibration in the floorboards that didn't match the rhythm of the mine's machinery. Someone else was in this abandoned section, moving carefully, deliberately, trying not to be detected. His hand froze halfway to the detonator caps. In his silent world, Jacob had learned to read the mountain like a book written in tremors and shifts of air pressure. The vibration pattern told him 3 things. The person was approximately 120 pounds, was wearing soft-soled shoes instead of mining boots, and was standing absolutely still about 30 feet behind him, watching. Not a miner, not security. Someone who didn't belong in the depths at all. Jacob turned slowly, his eyes adjusting to the lamp-lit darkness, and saw something that made his blood run colder than the deepest shaft. A woman in an expensive riding dress, her face covered in coal dust, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of his safety lamp. But what truly stopped his heart was the leather journal she was holding, open to a page covered in his own handwriting. The calculations for a demolition that would bring down the entire eastern support structure of the mine. She had found his planning notes. She knew everything. The woman's lips began to move, forming words he couldn't hear but could read with perfect clarity. "My name is Catherine Vandermeer, and I think you're planning to kill my father." Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward the iron pry bar on his belt, his mind calculating the impossible mathematics of the situation. If he eliminated the witness, he'd have to hide a body in a mine where every missing person triggered a full search. If he let her leave, she'd go straight to her father, and he'd be hanging from a rope by sunset. The nitroglycerin sat between them like a sleeping god, waiting for the slightest disturbance to wake. But Catherine didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply turned the journal around and pointed to a specific passage Jacob had written 3 weeks ago. A technical note about structural weak points in the mine's main support pillars. Then she did something that changed everything. She pulled out a pencil and began writing in the margin, her hand steady despite the fact that she was standing in an abandoned tunnel with a man who had every reason to kill her. She turned the journal back to him. The new writing read, "You're targeting the wrong section. The ballroom foundation is built on shaft 7, double the impact, half the collateral damage. I can show you." Jacob stared at the words, his mind reeling. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a collaboration. The Vandermeer mine was a monument to American ambition, a vast cathedral carved into the heart of the Comstock lode, where men traded their lungs and their lives for silver that would become cutlery in San Francisco mansions. The owner, Cornelius Vandermeer, was a man who measured success in speed and bodies, not safety. And now his own daughter was standing in the darkness, offering to help a deaf powder man optimize the demolition of her family's empire. Jacob had become the mine's primary powder man 5 years ago, after an explosion killed his brother and destroyed his hearing. Vandermeer had given him the most dangerous job in the mine, thinking a deaf man was disposable, controllable, unable to testify. But the mine owner had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd given a man with nothing left to lose access to enough explosives to reshape the Nevada landscape. For 5 years, Jacob had been patient, stealing small amounts of dynamite and nitroglycerin, hiding them in abandoned sections, waiting for the right moment. That moment had come 2 days ago when he'd read Vandermeer's lips during a meeting in the surface office. A plan to collapse the Chinese quarter with 40 workers still inside, all for an insurance payout worth more than 3 years of silver extraction. But now, staring at Catherine's additions to his demolition plans, Jacob realized something that made his carefully constructed revenge suddenly more complex. He wasn't the only person who wanted Cornelius Vandermeer buried under the mountain he'd brutalized. Catherine's lips moved again, slower this time so he could read every word. He's planning the collapse for next Friday. Night shift, 40 men dead. I heard everything. She paused, her eyes reflecting something Jacob recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for 5 years. The cold, clear focus of someone who had moved beyond anger into the realm of calculated action. But I think we can do better than just stopping him, she continued, her lips forming each word with deliberate precision. In 2 weeks, he's hosting the biggest social event in Nevada history. Every mine owner, every politician, every banker who's profited from this death machine will be in the ballroom directly above Shaft 7. We don't just collapse the Chinese quarter plan, we collapse the entire power structure. Jacob felt his pulse quicken, a rhythm he could sense through the vibration of his own heartbeat. This wasn't the naive daughter of privilege he'd expected. This was someone who had been planning her own revolution, waiting for the right weapon to appear. But before he could respond, Catherine's expression changed. Her eyes widened, looking past him toward the tunnel entrance. Jacob spun around and saw what had triggered her fear. A second lamp, moving toward them through the darkness, the light swinging in the distinctive pattern of mine security making their rounds. In his silent world, Jacob couldn't hear the approaching footsteps or the jingle of keys that would have warned a normal man. But he could feel the vibration growing stronger, could see the shadow lengthening on the tunnel wall. They had maybe 30 seconds before the security guard rounded the corner and discovered the mine owner's daughter standing next to enough stolen explosives to level half of Virginia City. Catherine moved first, grabbing Jacob's arm and pointing frantically toward a side passage he'd thought was too narrow for human passage. She was already moving, her expensive dress tearing on the rough stone as she squeezed into the gap. Jacob hesitated for one crucial second, looking back at his carefully arranged nitroglycerin, his 5 years of patient collection sitting exposed in the lamplight. If he left it, the guard would find it and sound the alarm. If he tried to hide it, he wouldn't have time to follow Catherine before being discovered. And if he was discovered, everything ended right here, right now, with 40 Chinese miners still condemned to die in a collapse scheduled for 9 days from today. The lamp shadow grew longer. Jacob could feel the vibration of boot heels on rock getting stronger, closer, almost upon him. He made his decision in the span of a heartbeat, grabbing 2 bottles of nitroglycerin and the detonator caps, leaving the rest as he plunged into the narrow passage after Catherine. The gap in the rock was barely 18 inches wide, a natural fissure that should have been sealed years ago according to safety regulations that Vandermeer routinely ignored. Jacob felt the stone scraping his shoulders, felt the terrifying sensation of being wedged between millions of tons of mountain with unstable explosives clutched against his chest. In the blackness ahead, he could see the faint glow of Catherine's lamp, moving deeper into a space that wasn't on any official mine map. Behind him, though he couldn't hear it, the security guard's lamp swept across the abandoned chamber, illuminating the remaining crates of explosives that Jacob had been forced to leave behind. The guard stopped, his eyes widening as he registered what he was seeing, his hand moving toward the alarm whistle on his belt. But the guard never got the chance to blow that whistle, because in that exact moment, something else happened that no one could have predicted. A deep, resonant vibration ran through the entire mountain, a tremor that Jacob felt in his bones, even if he couldn't hear the accompanying sound. It wasn't an earthquake. It was worse. Somewhere in the lower levels, someone else had just detonated an explosive charge, and from the strength of the vibration, it wasn't a controlled demolition. It was either an accident or sabotage, and either way, it meant the mine was about to become an entirely different kind of battlefield. Jacob emerged from the narrow passage into a chamber he'd never seen before, a natural cavern that opened up like the interior of a massive stone lung. Catherine was standing in the center, her lamp held high, illuminating walls covered in something that made Jacob's eyes widen in shock. Maps. Detailed, technical drawings of every shaft, every support pillar, every structural weakness in the Vandermeer mine. But these weren't Jacob's maps. These were older, more comprehensive, drawn by someone with professional engineering knowledge. Catherine's lips moved in the flickering light. My mother made these. Before she died, before she understood what kind of man she'd married. The vibration came again, stronger this time, and a shower of dust fell from the cavern's ceiling. Whatever had exploded in the lower levels was triggering a chain reaction, and Jacob didn't need his hearing to know that the mountain was beginning to move in ways that were very, very wrong. Catherine grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength, her lips forming words that cut through all pretense. The explosion wasn't an accident. My father just triggered his insurance collapse 3 days early. Those 40 men are down there right now, and the tunnel is already starting to seal. She pointed to one of the maps, her finger tracing a route that led deeper into the mountain, toward the Chinese Quarter where men were probably already realizing that the walls around them were closing in. We have maybe 10 minutes before the main support fails, Catherine continued, her face illuminated by lamplight and determination. You can either use those bottles to finish your revenge, or you can use them to blast a new escape route before 40 men suffocate in the dark. Your choice, Mr. Stone. Justice or rescue. You don't get both. Jacob looked down at the 2 bottles of nitroglycerin in his hands, then back at the maps on the wall, then at the woman who had somehow transformed from a privileged daughter into something that looked very much like a co-conspirator in either salvation or damnation. The mountain continued its ominous settling, a giant slowly waking to the violence being done in its depths. And in that moment, Jacob Stone realized that his 5 years of patient planning had just been compressed into a choice that would have to be made in the next 60 seconds. Behind them, back through the narrow passage, he could feel new vibrations, multiple footsteps, shouting he couldn't hear, the chaos of a mine security response to both the explosion and the discovered cache of stolen explosives. Ahead, deeper in the mountain, 40 men who didn't even know Jacob's name were running out of air and time. Catherine handed him her mother's maps, her eyes asking a question that her lips didn't need to form. The clock was ticking, the mountain was falling, and the deaf powder man who had spent 5 years planning the perfect revenge was about to discover that sometimes the hardest explosion to trigger is the one that saves lives instead of taking them. But as Jacob made his decision, something else registered in his peripheral vision. A detail on Catherine's mother's maps that shouldn't have been there. A marking that indicated someone else had been planning a demolition of the Vandermeer mine. Someone who had died before completing the work. And the date on that original plan was exactly 5 years ago. The same day Jacob's brother had died in what everyone called an accident. What if Thomas's death hadn't been an accident at all? What if someone had tried this exact same plan before, and Vandermeer had stopped them permanently? The question burned hotter than nitroglycerin, but there was no time to answer it. Not yet. In the depths of a mountain that had already decided to become a tomb, there are only 2 types of decisions. the ones that save lives and the ones that take them. Sometimes, if a man is unlucky enough, or perhaps blessed enough, he discovers that those two types of decisions are actually the same choice viewed from different angles. Jacob Stone was about to become that unlucky, blessed man, and he had exactly 9 minutes to decide which angle history would remember. The nitroglycerin bottles felt heavier in Jacob's hands than they had any right to, as if the weight of 40 lives had somehow transferred into the glass and oil mixture. Catherine stood before him, her expensive riding dress torn and covered in coal dust, transformed from a society daughter into something that looked remarkably like a revolutionary. Behind her, the maps on the cavern wall told a story that Jacob's mind was still struggling to process. This wasn't a spontaneous rebellion. This was a continuation of something that had started 5 years ago, something that had gotten his brother killed. But the mountain didn't care about revelations or revenge or the complicated mathematics of justice. The mountain only understood physics, and right now, the physics were catastrophically simple. Another vibration rolled through the stone, stronger than before, and Jacob felt it travel up through his boots, into his legs, settling in his chest like a second heartbeat. He couldn't hear the accompanying sound, but he knew from experience what that particular frequency meant. A major support structure had just failed somewhere in the lower levels. Catherine's lips moved with urgent precision, each word carefully formed so he could read them in the dim lamplight. She pointed to her mother's map, her finger tracing 3 passages leading to the Chinese quarter, then crossing out 2 of them with a slash of her hand across her throat. Only one route remained open. Jacob's mind was already running the calculations, a process that had become instinctive after 5 years of working with explosives in conditions that would make a normal demolitionist weep. He looked past Catherine toward the deeper darkness where the maps indicated the Chinese quarter should be, then back at the narrow passage they'd squeezed through, where he could feel the vibrations of multiple security guards now flooding the abandoned chamber. 2 bottles, 1 chance, 40 lives hanging in the balance. Jacob made his decision by not making one at all. He simply started moving deeper into the mountain, following the routes marked on Catherine's mother's maps, trusting that a dead woman's engineering knowledge was accurate enough to navigate by. Catherine fell in behind him, her lamp providing the only light in a darkness that seemed to press against them like a physical weight. The passage descended sharply, the air growing hotter and thinner with every step. Jacob could feel the change in atmospheric pressure against his skin, could see the way the lamplight began to flicker as oxygen levels dropped. They were moving toward a section of the mine that was already starving for air, and somewhere ahead, 40 men were breathing what little remained. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 minutes, Jacob felt a new vibration through the soles of his boots. Rhythmic, desperate, weakening. Metal on stone, the unmistakable pattern of men pounding with whatever tools they had left, signaling their position to rescuers they weren't sure existed. The rhythm was irregular now, fading, the sound of strength running out along with oxygen. They rounded a corner, and there it was, a wall of solid granite, and pressed against it from the other side, the fading vibrations of men who had maybe 10 minutes of breathable air left. Jacob set down the nitroglycerin bottles with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, then pressed his palms flat against the rock wall. In his silent world, touch had become a sense more valuable than hearing had ever been. He could feel the desperate pounding on the other side, could map the thickness of the stone between them by the way the tremors traveled through the granite matrix. 8 feet, maybe 9. Thicker than he'd hoped. Catherine knelt beside him, pulling out a piece of chalk and beginning to sketch directly on the stone floor. A cross-section diagram of what she thought the wall structure looked like based on her mother's maps. Jacob watched her work, impressed despite the circumstances by the precision of her technical drawing. But as he studied her sketch, Jacob's stomach dropped. The wall was too thick. 2 bottles of nitroglycerin, even perfectly placed, would crack it but not breach it completely. The trapped miners would hear the explosion, would feel hope surge through them, and then would suffocate in the dark. realizing that rescue had come close but not close enough, unless someone stayed with the charge. Nitroglycerin wasn't stable enough to simply set and walk away from. The slightest shift during the blast sequence would change the angle of force and waste the explosion's power against solid rock instead of channeling through the fault lines. Someone would have to hold the bottles in exact position during detonation, becoming part of the demolition itself. It was a suicide placement, and they both knew it. Catherine saw the realization cross his face and immediately reached for one of the bottles. Jacob's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip firm enough to stop her but gentle enough not to hurt. He shook his head sharply. She pulled her hand free and began writing on the cave floor with chalk, the words appearing in stark white against dark stone. My mother tried to stop him 5 years ago. She planned everything, charges, timing, evidence. But he found out. Her cave-in wasn't an accident. Jacob's world tilted as he read the next line. The explosion that killed your brother the same day? She had recruited him as her demolition expert. My father murdered them both. The chalk clattered from Catherine's hand as she looked up at him, and Jacob saw in her eyes the same thing he'd been carrying for 5 years, the weight of a death that demanded answering, a debt written in blood that compounded interest every day. It went unpaid. She picked up the chalk again, her hand shaking now but still legible. I was 14, didn't understand then. Took me 5 years to find her maps, her journals, her evidence. I've been waiting for someone who could finish it. Then I saw you in my father's office 2 days ago. I saw your eyes when he announced the Chinese quarter collapse. I knew. Catherine set down the chalk and picked up both bottles of nitroglycerin, cradling them like the instruments of justice they were. Her lips moved slowly, making sure he caught every word. This is my inheritance. My mother started it and died for it. I'm finishing it. You save these men today, destroy my father tomorrow. That's the deal. Another massive vibration rolled through the cavern, and this time Jacob saw what he'd been dreading. A crack appearing in the ceiling above them, a thin dark line that began to drip water and small stones. The mountain was accelerating its collapse. Jacob stared at Catherine, at the bottles in her hands, at the impossible mathematics of the situation. His mind raced through alternatives, technical solutions, any possible configuration that didn't require a human sacrifice. Then his eyes caught on something. The water dripping from the ceiling crack, the rate of flow, the angle of the fissure. His hands moved before his conscious mind had fully processed the solution, grabbing the chalk from the floor and sketching frantically beside Catherine's diagram. A cradle, timber supports wedged into the ceiling crack, the bottles suspended at a precise angle, a small black powder charge as a delayed trigger. The initial blast from above would drive the nitroglycerin down into the wall at the exact vector needed to channel through the fault lines. The water would help stabilize the bottles during the critical first microseconds. Theoretically. Catherine studied his sketch, her engineering education evident in the way her eyes traced the force vectors. Her lips formed one word. Margin? Jacob held up his hand, thumb and forefinger almost touching. Nearly zero, but not quite impossible. For a long moment, Catherine didn't move. Jacob could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the symbolic power of sacrificing herself versus the practical reality that her death right now would accomplish nothing except adding her name to her father's body count. Finally, she set the bottles down with infinite care and nodded once. What followed was 3 minutes of the most intense and terrifying work of Jacob Stone's life. He showed Catherine how to identify load-bearing timbers, which ones could be removed without triggering immediate collapse. Together they constructed the cradle, wedging it into the ceiling crack with stones and debris. Every movement precise because precision was the only thing standing between them and instant vaporization. The pounding from the other side of the wall had become weaker, less rhythmic. The trapped miners were running out of strength, which meant they were running out of oxygen. Jacob could feel the desperation in the fading vibrations. They had one chance. Jacob carefully lifted the first nitroglycerin bottle and placed it into the timber cradle, his hands moving with surgeon's precision. The oil inside shifted with a motion that made his heart spike. The second bottle went in beside it, and now they had 32 ounces of liquid death suspended above their heads in a contraption made from scavenged wood and desperate mathematics. He pulled out his emergency kit, detonator caps, fuses, a thumb-sized portion of black powder. This was the most delicate part, cutting a fuse to give them exactly 90 seconds of burn time, enough to reach safety, not so much that the mountain's continued collapse would destroy the setup first. Jacob cut the fuse by feel and experience, embedded the detonator cap in the black powder, and positioned everything so the initial blast would drive the bottles downward at the calculated angle. The entire assembly looked terrifyingly fragile. Catherine touched his arm and pointed back toward their entry passage, her expression asking the obvious question. Jacob nodded and pulled out his waterproof matches. He struck one, the flame brilliant in the darkness, and touched it to the fuse. The spark caught, the flame beginning its slow crawl toward detonation. They ran, 30 heartbeats. Halfway through the passage, the fuse halfway to the detonator, 60 heartbeats. Back to the map cavern, but not far enough yet, 70 heartbeats. Catherine stumbled. Jacob pulled her up without slowing, 80 heartbeats. The narrow gap ahead, almost there, 90 heartbeats. They threw themselves into the passage, squeezing through. 95 heartbeats. His calculation had been off by 5 seconds. 100 heartbeats. The world turned white. Even in Jacob's silent world, he felt the explosion with every cell in his body. A pressure wave that traveled through stone itself. A vibration so massive it seemed to stop his heart before restarting it with a painful lurch. The narrow gap around them flexed, the mountain adjusting to the new reality carved into its depths. Dust billowed through the passage, choking, blinding. Catherine's hand gripped his arm with desperate strength as they froze, waiting to discover if they'd achieved surgical precision or triggered catastrophic collapse. The vibrations continued for what felt like forever, then gradually began to subside. The dust started to settle. They were alive, and the passage around them hadn't fallen. But relief lasted exactly 3 seconds, because that's when Jacob felt the new vibration. Footsteps, dozens of them, moving through the main tunnel toward their position. Security forces, closing in. Catherine felt it too. Without hesitation, she began moving back toward the explosion site, toward the unknown outcome of their gambit. Jacob followed, because there was nowhere else to go, and because he needed to know if 40 men were breathing or buried. They emerged into the map cavern, and the scene that greeted them made Jacob's breath catch. The explosion had worked. The granite wall had shattered along the fault line exactly as calculated. But the blast had also breached something unexpected. A massive underground water source. A river now poured through the newly opened passage, flooding into the cavern at a rate that would fill the entire lower level within minutes. And through that river, stumbling and coughing and very much alive, came the miners. The first man through the gap fell to his knees in the shallow water, his face tilted up toward the ceiling, his mouth open in what Jacob couldn't hear but could recognize as sobbing. The second man helped him up, their hands clasped together with the desperate strength of men who had just been given back their lives. They kept coming, a stream of humanity emerging from what should have been their tomb. Young men and old, their faces covered in coal dust and tears, their eyes wide with the shock of salvation. One man carried another on his back, his friend too weak to walk after the oxygen deprivation. Another paused long enough to press his forehead against the shattered granite wall, his lips moving in what had to be prayer. Jacob felt something tighten in his chest as he watched them. These weren't abstractions, weren't just numbers in a moral calculation. They were men with families, with stories, with futures that had been measured in minutes and were now measured in years again. An older miner, his beard more gray than black, stopped in front of Catherine as he passed. He didn't speak, either because he couldn't or because he understood words weren't adequate. He simply placed his hand over his heart, then extended it to her in a gesture that transcended language. Catherine took his hand, and Jacob saw her face crack for just a moment before she regained control. The miners kept coming, 38, 39, 40, until the last man squeezed through, helping two others who could barely stand. As they stumbled past toward the narrow passage that would lead them to safety, one of them looked directly at Jacob. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that moment Jacob saw something he hadn't expected: recognition. The miner's lips formed two words: "Thank you." Then he was gone, following his companions toward whatever freedom looked like for men who had just been resurrected. Catherine was already directing the evacuation flow, pointing toward the escape route with natural authority. But as the last miner disappeared through the narrow gap, Jacob felt the vibration pattern from the main tunnel change. The footsteps had stopped advancing and started spreading out in a different formation, a containment pattern he recognized from watching how security responded to emergencies. They weren't coming to arrest saboteurs. They were coming to seal the section entirely, to bury the evidence and everyone in it under a controlled collapse. Cornelius Vandermeer wasn't going to let his daughter expose him any more than he'd let his wife do it 5 years ago. Catherine saw the realization on Jacob's face and understood. Her lips moved. "He's going to bury us." Jacob nodded grimly. They were in a flooding cavern with one exit leading directly to security forces preparing a collapse. No weapons, no explosives, and maybe 3 minutes before the water level rose high enough to drown anyone still here. The Chinese miners they'd saved were gone, hopefully making it through before security sealed them in. But Jacob and Catherine were trapped between rising water and falling stone. Catherine grabbed his arm and pointed not toward the exit, but toward the maps on the wall, specifically toward a marking in red chalk that Jacob hadn't noticed before in the chaos. The marking indicated a secondary passage leading away from the Chinese quarter toward a section that predated the Vandermeer operation entirely. Old Spanish mining tunnels from the 1700s, long abandoned, considered too unstable to explore. Catherine's lips formed words that were either salvation or suicide. My mother's escape route. She planned for everything. The water was up to their knees now, rising as more of the underground river poured through the breach. They had maybe 60 seconds to decide: fight through security and almost certainly die, or plunge into an unmapped tunnel system that might lead to freedom, or might simply be a slower way to die. Jacob looked at Catherine, at this woman who had emerged from privilege to become something her father would never understand, and he saw his brother's face reflected in hers. The same determination, the same willingness to fight a system that ground people into dust. He'd already made one impossible choice today. What was one more leap into darkness? Jacob grabbed the lamp and started toward the red chalk marking. Behind them, the vibrations of the security formation grew stronger, more organized. But as they reached the entrance to the old Spanish tunnel, Catherine stopped suddenly, her hand gripping Jacob's shoulder. She was staring at something on the cavern wall, something that had been hidden behind the flow of miners but was now visible. Another notation on her mother's map, this one in black ink instead of chalk. Technical diagrams, calculations. Catherine's face went pale even in the orange lamplight. Her lips moved slowly. This wasn't just an escape route. She pointed to the calculations, her finger trembling slightly. My mother was planning to flood the entire mine. These show exactly how much explosive force would breach the underground river permanently, turn every tunnel into a waterway, make the whole operation impossible to continue. Catherine turned to Jacob, her eyes reflecting terrible understanding. We didn't just save 40 miners. We accidentally triggered the beginning of her final plan. If the water keeps rising at this rate, in approximately 6 hours, the entire Vandermeer mine, including the ballroom where my father is hosting his celebration tomorrow night, is going to be underwater. Jacob felt the weight of that revelation settle over him like the mountain itself. What had started as a desperate rescue had somehow become the completion of a revolution 5 years in the making. The vibrations from the security forces changed pattern again, heavy drilling equipment being brought in, the kind used for rapid tunnel collapse, maybe 3 minutes before this section was permanently sealed. Catherine made the decision for both of them, grabbing Jacob's hand and pulling him into the old Spanish tunnel. Into darkness her mother had marked as either salvation or damnation. The passage smelled of decay and stagnant water, air thick with centuries, but it led away from the approaching collapse, away from the rising flood, into a part of the mountain that Cornelius Vandermeer didn't own and couldn't control. As they plunged into the darkness, the last thing Jacob felt was the vibration of controlled collapse beginning behind them, security forces sealing the section as ordered, trapping the rising water on the wrong side of tons of deliberately fallen rock. They didn't know it yet, but they'd just locked Vandermeer's security on the wrong side of a flood that was now impossible to stop. A slowly rising tide that would spend the next 6 hours filling every tunnel, every shaft, every carefully excavated vein with the mountain's revenge. And somewhere above them, in a ballroom built on greed and maintained with blood, Cornelius Vandermeer was preparing to celebrate his greatest triumph, completely unaware that his entire world was about to drown. The old Spanish tunnel descended sharply into absolute darkness, the lamplight barely penetrating air that hadn't been disturbed in over a century. Catherine and Jacob moved in silence, following a path marked on maps that existed only in memory now. But 30 feet into the passage, Jacob's hand touched something carved into the tunnel wall that made him stop so suddenly Catherine nearly collided with him. A symbol. Geometric. Precise. Jacob had seen it before, in one very specific place, carved into the support beam that had collapsed and killed his brother Thomas 5 years ago. The exact same symbol, as if someone had been leaving a trail that only the right person would recognize. Catherine held the lamp closer, and they both saw what the symbol was pointing toward. A side chamber that shouldn't exist according to any map, official or otherwise. And inside that chamber, barely visible in the lamplight, was something that would transform everything they thought they understood about Catherine's mother's plan, Thomas's death, and exactly how long this revolution had been in the making. Stacked against the far wall, preserved in the dry air of the ancient tunnel, were enough crates of dynamite and nitroglycerin to demolish not just the Vandermeer mine, but half of Virginia City. And sitting on top of the nearest crate, as if waiting for someone to finally find it, was a leather journal with 2 names written on the cover in faded ink. Thomas Stone and Eleanor Vandermeer. The Final Reckoning. There are moments in a man's life when the past stops being a place he's moved away from and becomes instead a room he's been standing in all along, just with the lights off. Jacob Stone stood in the dusty chamber of the old Spanish tunnel, staring at his dead brother's handwriting on a journal that shouldn't exist, and felt 5 years of carefully constructed understanding collapse more thoroughly than any mountain ever could. The lamp in Catherine's hand cast shadows that danced across crates of explosives that had been waiting in the darkness like a promise made to the dead. And Jacob realized with a cold certainty that everything, absolutely everything, had been planned long before he'd ever thought to plan it himself. But before we witness how the dead reach across time to finish what the living started, I need to know you're ready to see this conspiracy to its final, explosive conclusion. If you want to discover how deep the roots of revolution truly go, subscribe now and stay until the mountain falls. On a scale of 0 to 10, how much does a story of multi-generational justice resonate with you? Comment below, because the voices of the forgotten are finally about to be heard. Now let us open the journal and discover what Thomas Stone and Eleanor Vandermeer had been planning in the weeks before they were murdered. Catherine's hand trembled as she reached for the journal, but Jacob's hand was faster, his fingers closing around the worn leather with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. This was his brother's handwriting, his brother's thoughts, his brother's voice speaking from beyond a grave that Jacob had visited every Sunday for 5 years, without knowing it was actually a murder site. He opened the journal to the first page, and even in the dim lamplight, Thomas's precise engineering script was perfectly legible. The entry was dated March 15th, 1868, exactly 6 weeks before the explosion that had killed him and Eleanor Vandermeer. Met with EV again today. She's not what I expected when Dennison said a concerned citizen wanted to discuss mine safety. She's Vandermeer's wife, for God's sake. and she's asking me to help her destroy her own husband's empire. Says she has evidence of 53 deaths in the past 2 years alone, all covered up, all blamed on worker negligence or bad luck. Says her husband is planning something bigger, a deliberate collapse of an entire section to collect insurance money. Says she can't live with it anymore. Can't sleep in a house built on bones. I told her I'd think about it. But I'm already thinking about Jacob, about how many times he's come home coughing blood, about the way the timber supports shake when you lean against them, about Marcus Liu, who lost both legs last month and got paid $50 in a handshake. I'm thinking I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me to do something that matters. Jacob felt Catherine reading over his shoulder, her breath catching as she recognized her mother's initials. He turned the page, his hand steadier now, driven by a need to understand that overrode the pain of discovery. The journal detailed weeks of secret meetings, of Eleanor Vandermeer sharing her husband's private papers, of Thomas conducting structural surveys under the guise of routine maintenance. The plan had been methodical, careful, designed to look like natural geological failure rather than deliberate sabotage. They were going to flood the mine through the same underground river that Jacob and Catherine had accidentally breached, making it impossible to continue operations without massive investment that Vandermeer's debt-ridden empire couldn't afford. But as Jacob read further, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Eleanor hadn't just been planning to destroy the mine. She'd been planning to expose her husband publicly, to bring down not just Cornelius Vandermeer, but the entire network of mine owners, politicians and bankers who profited from the industrial slaughter of working men. And she'd been gathering evidence that went far beyond Virginia City. Thomas's handwriting became more urgent as the entries progressed. April 3rd, 1868. E.V. showed me the ledgers today. Real ones, not the doctored books Vandermeer shows investors. The Comstock operations alone have killed over 300 men in 5 years. But it's worse than that. She has correspondence between her husband and 9 other mine owners across Nevada and California. They're coordinating, deliberately keeping safety standards low to maximize profit, sharing lists of troublemakers to blacklist across the entire territory. They're running the mines like a cartel, and the territorial government is in their pocket. She wants to time the exposure with the flooding, destroy the physical infrastructure while simultaneously releasing the evidence to newspapers in San Francisco and New York. Make it impossible for them to rebuild both the mine and their reputations. I asked her what happens to her when this comes out. She said she's already dead, has been for years, just waiting for her body to catch up. Said the woman she was when she married Vandermeer died the first time she walked past a widow in town, and knew her husband had created that widow and felt nothing. Jacob turned another page and found a technical diagram that made his breath catch. A detailed schematic of explosive placements throughout the mine, including the exact location where he and Catherine had just accidentally triggered the flood. Thomas and Eleanor had mapped every structural weakness, calculated the precise amount of force needed to breach the underground river, planned for contingencies and escape routes. They'd even planned for failure. April 20th, 1868. If something happens to us before we can complete the operation, we're leaving this cash for whoever comes next. Evie is writing letters to her daughter to be opened when Catherine turns 18. I'm leaving markers that Jacob will recognize if he ever looks for them. We both know Vandermeer is getting suspicious. His head of security has been following Evie, and I've noticed the same faces watching me in town. But we're committed now. Even if we don't live to see it, someone will finish this. The mountain keeps its secrets until it's ready to speak, and we're teaching it what to say. The next entry was dated April 28, 1868, 2 days before the explosion. Final preparations complete. Cash is stocked and hidden in the old Spanish tunnels. Maps are drawn. Evidence packets are sealed and hidden in 3 separate locations. E.V. has arranged for the documents to be released to the press if both of us die within a week of each other. Her lawyer has instructions to open a safety deposit box in San Francisco. We trigger the flood tomorrow night during the shift change when the mine is least populated. With luck, we'll breach the river, get out clean, and be halfway to San Francisco before Vandermeer realizes his empire is literally and figuratively underwater. Jacob, if you're reading this, it means we failed and you're standing in our tomb. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry I'm going to make you live with another secret. But you're stronger than me, always have been. Finish what we started. Flood the mountain, expose the bastards, make them pay for every drop of blood they've spilled. Your brother, Thomas. The journal entry ended there, but several pages later, in different handwriting, Eleanor's, there was a final message. Catherine, by the time you read this, you'll know what kind of man your father really is. I've left you evidence, maps, and tools. I've also left you a choice. You can use this information to negotiate your own comfortable future, to leverage it for wealth and status. Or you can finish what Thomas and I started. I won't tell you which to choose. I won't haunt you with my ghost's expectations. But I will tell you this. I spent 20 years living comfortably on blood money, telling myself I didn't know, that I couldn't change anything, that my comfort was worth the price others paid. I was wrong, and every day I have to live with that wrongness is a day I deserve whatever hell is coming. If you choose to fight, know that I'm proud of you. If you choose to walk away, know that I understand. Either way, you're my daughter, and you deserved a better mother than the one I was. Destroy this journal after you read it. Or don't. Maybe someday it'll be history instead of sedition. With love and regret, Eleanor Vandermeer. Catherine's hand had moved to her mouth at some point during the reading, her eyes wet in the lamplight. Jacob closed the journal gently and looked at the crates of explosives stacked against the tunnel wall. Enough destructive power to complete the operation that Thomas and Eleanor had died trying to execute. The vibrations from above had changed again. The security forces had finished sealing the flooded section, and now Jacob could feel a new pattern. Heavy footsteps moving toward the surface, the rhythm of men who thought their work was done. They'd buried the evidence, sealed the witnesses, and were now returning to report mission accomplished to Cornelius Vandermeer. But they'd made the same mistake Vandermeer had made 5 years ago. They'd assumed that sealing a tomb meant ending a revolution. Catherine's lips moved, her voice probably hoarse from the dust and emotion. But Jacob read the words clearly. The celebration, tomorrow night. Every mine owner in Nevada will be in that ballroom. Jacob nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications. Vandermeer's grand social event, the engagement announcement, the gathering of the territory's industrial elite. It wasn't just a party. It was an opportunity that Thomas and Eleanor could never have imagined, because 5 years ago that ballroom hadn't existed yet. Vandermeer had built his monument to access directly above the mine's main support structure, had engineered his own gallows without realizing it. But there was a problem. And it was a problem that made the moral mathematics suddenly much more complicated than simple revenge. The ballroom wouldn't just have mine owners and politicians. It would have their wives, their daughters, their sons. Innocent people, or at least people whose only crime was being related to monsters. Jacob had spent 5 years imagining Cornelius Vandermeer's death in elaborate detail, but he'd always imagined it as surgical, targeted, just. The scenario forming in his mind now wasn't surgical. It was apocalyptic. Catherine seemed to read his hesitation. She pulled out her chalk and began writing on the tunnel floor, the words appearing in quick, determined strokes. Mother's evidence packets. If we can find them, release them to the press before the flood reaches the ballroom. Give people time to evacuate. We destroy the physical infrastructure but preserve the moral high ground. Exposure and demolition, just like they planned. She paused, then added, or we do nothing. Let the flood happen. Call it an act of God. Those 40 miners we saved tell their story, and maybe that's enough. Jacob looked at the options written in chalk, at the choice that was somehow both simpler and more complex than anything he'd faced so far. Thomas and Eleanor had planned for surgical precision, for targeted destruction with maximum exposure and minimum casualties. But they'd had time, resources, and the element of surprise. Jacob and Catherine had approximately 18 hours before the rising water reached critical levels. No idea where the evidence packets were hidden, and a mine owner who was now actively hunting them through the mountain. He picked up the chalk and wrote beneath Catherine's words, "Third option, We find the evidence, we expose everything, and we give Vandermeer a choice. Evacuate his celebration and face public ruin, or stay and drown with his empire. Let him choose which legacy he wants. Catherine read his words, and for the first time since Jacob had met her in the flooded chamber, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who just recognized a kindred spirit in the mathematics of justice. She wrote one more line. Mother hid the evidence packets in 3 locations. One in the mine, one in the house, one in town. We'll need to split up. Jacob shook his head firmly and pointed to himself, then to the word mine on the floor. Then he pointed to Catherine and firmly crossed out the word house. His meaning was clear. She wasn't going back to the place where her father could trap her, where she'd be most vulnerable. Catherine's jaw set in a stubborn line that probably ran in the Vandermeer family. She grabbed the chalk back and wrote, "The house packet is in my mother's room. Only I know the hiding place, and someone needs to get the evidence from town, the lawyer's office. We do this together or not at all. You taught me to handle explosives, Stone. Trust me to handle my father." Before Jacob could argue further, a new vibration rolled through the tunnel. Not from the security forces above, but from deeper in the mountain, from the direction of the flooding. The water was rising faster than expected, the underground river now flowing freely through the breach they'd created. According to Eleanor's calculations in the journal, they had approximately 6 hours before the water reached the lower levels of the mine where the remaining evidence packet was hidden. Maybe 8 hours before it reached the foundation of the ballroom. 12 hours at most before the entire eastern section of the Vandermeer operation was completely submerged. But those timelines assumed normal flow rates. If the breach was larger than calculated, if the river was running higher due to recent rainfall, if any number of variables shifted, the whole timeline could collapse like a house of cards. Jacob pulled out Thomas's pocket watch, which he'd carried every day for 5 years without knowing it was actually a revolutionary's timepiece. The hands showed 2:47 p.m. Vandermeer's celebration was scheduled to begin at 8 p.m. the following evening, approximately 29 hours away. They had to find 3 evidence packets hidden 5 years ago in a town that had grown, a mine that had expanded, and a house that had been renovated. They had to somehow get that evidence to the newspapers without being caught by Vandermeer's security forces, who were actively hunting them. And they had to do it all while the mountain was slowly filling with water that would eventually drown everything Cornelius Vandermeer had built. Jacob looked at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw not the privileged daughter who'd confronted him in the explosives chamber, but the heir to a revolution that had been 5 years in the making. She'd spent those years preparing without knowing what she was preparing for, educating herself in engineering and geology and the technical details of how things broke, all because some part of her understood that her mother's death had been a beginning, not an ending. He made his decision and wrote on the floor, "You get the house packet, I get the mine packet. We meet in town at the newspaper office with whatever we find. If one of us doesn't make it, the other finishes it alone. Agreed." Catherine read his words, then extended her hand for a shake. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from the past few hours of manual labor, transformed from society softness into something that felt like partnership. They spent the next hour planning with the precision that Thomas and Eleanor had taught them through the journal. Catherine sketched the layout of the Vandermeer house from memory, indicating the secret compartment in her mother's room where Eleanor had hidden her packet. Jacob studied the mine maps, locating the section where the evidence was supposedly hidden, deep in the old works, in an area that was already partially flooded but still theoretically accessible. The third packet, according to Eleanor's notes, was in a safety deposit box at the First Nevada Bank, held by a lawyer named Morrison who had instructions to open it only if both Thomas Stone and Eleanor Vandermeer died within a week of each other. That condition had been met 5 years ago, which meant either Morrison had opened the box and done nothing with the contents, or Vandermeer had gotten to him first. Either way, that packet was the most uncertain element of the plan. As they prepared to split up, Catherine pulled something from the inner pocket of her torn riding dress. A small pistol, pearl-handled and delicate, the kind of weapon a society woman might carry for protection. She offered it to Jacob, but he shook his head and pointed to the crates of explosives instead. His weapon was already chosen. Catherine kept the pistol and added 2 items from the cache: a stick of dynamite and a box of matches wrapped in oilcloth. She met Jacob's eyes, and he saw the unspoken understanding pass between them. If things went wrong, if capture was imminent, they both knew what had to be done. Better to die on their own terms than give Vandermeer the satisfaction of a public execution. They had one more decision to make before separating: how to exit the Spanish tunnels without being immediately captured by the security forces that were undoubtedly watching every known entrance to the mine. Jacob studied Eleanor's maps and found what he was looking for: a ventilation shaft that opened on the north side of the mountain, far from the main operations, in an area that had been abandoned when the vein played out 3 years ago. It would be a brutal climb, nearly vertical in places, but it would get them to the surface unseen. Catherine looked at the route Jacob was indicating and swallowed hard. She'd probably never climbed anything more challenging than a staircase in her entire privileged life. But she nodded and began checking her supplies, redistributing weight in her pockets, preparing for an ascent that would test whether her transformation from society daughter to revolutionary was complete. They moved deeper into the Spanish tunnels, following Eleanor's maps through passages that became progressively narrower and steeper. The air grew thinner, the lamp flame smaller, and twice they had to squeeze through gaps that seemed physically impossible for human bodies to navigate. But they made it. After 40 minutes of climbing that left both of them scraped, bruised, and gasping, they emerged into daylight that felt like a physical assault after hours in the darkness. The sun was setting, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple that Jacob hadn't truly appreciated in years. The beauty of it felt almost obscene, given what they were about to attempt. They were on the north face of the mountain, overlooking a valley that showed no signs of human habitation. Below them, barely visible through the scrub brush and rocks, was a narrow trail that would lead back toward Virginia City from an unexpected direction. Catherine checked her appearance in a small, compact mirror she'd somehow managed not to lose during the ordeal. Her face was streaked with coal dust. Her expensive riding dress was torn beyond repair, and her hair had come completely loose from its proper styling. She looked, in short, like exactly what she was: a woman who just crawled out of a collapsing mine, which meant she couldn't go into town looking like this without attracting immediate attention and questions. Jacob pointed to a small creek running down the mountainside, then mimed washing and changing. Catherine nodded and began moving toward the water, but then stopped and turned back to face him. Her lips moved carefully, making sure he could read every word. "If I don't make it out of that house, you finish it anyway. Promise me." Jacob held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. The promise was made, simple and absolute. Catherine's lips moved again. "And if you don't make it out of the mine, I finish it. For Thomas and my mother." Another nod. Another promise. The revolution would continue regardless of who survived to see it. Then Catherine did something unexpected. She pulled Jacob into a quick, fierce embrace. The kind of hug shared between soldiers before battle, between people who understood they might not see each other again. When she pulled back, her eyes were dry but intense. "Thank you for not being the kind of man who told me to stay safe while you did the dangerous work," she said, her lips forming the words with precision. "My mother chose your brother because he treated her like a partner, not a possession. You're doing the same for me." Jacob didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply touched his hand to his heart, then extended it toward her. The same gesture the old Chinese miner had made. A promise deeper than words, a solidarity that transcended class and gender and all the artificial divisions that men like Cornelius Vandermeer used to maintain power. Then they split up. Catherine moved toward the creek to clean up and plan her approach to the Vandermeer house. Jacob turned back toward the mountain, toward the flooded mine where Thomas's evidence packet waited in the darkness. As he began his descent toward a different entrance, one of the abandoned sections that he could navigate even in his silence, Jacob felt the weight of the past 5 years shifting on his shoulders. He'd thought he'd been planning revenge, but he'd actually been preparing to finish someone else's revolution. He'd thought his brother had died in a tragic accident, but Thomas had actually died as a revolutionary, a soldier in a war against industrial murder. The knowledge should have made him angry, should have felt like a theft of his own agency. But instead, it felt like coming home to a room he'd been living in all along, just with the lights finally turned on. Jacob reached the abandoned entrance and paused, his hand resting on the timber frame that was already showing signs of water damage. The flood was rising faster than expected, which meant his window for retrieving the evidence was even narrower than he'd calculated. But before he descended into the darkness one more time, he pulled out Thomas's journal and opened it to the last page his brother had written. He read the final lines again. "You're stronger than me, always have been. Finish what we started." Jacob touched his fingers to the words, feeling the indentation of the pen in the paper, as close as he'd ever get to touching his brother's hand again. Then he closed the journal, secured it in his inner pocket next to the 2 remaining detonator caps and the length of fuse he'd saved from the earlier blast. The mountain was waiting. The evidence was waiting. And somewhere in the darkness below, the rising water was counting down the hours until Cornelius Vandermeer's empire would drown in the consequences of its own cruelty. Jacob Stone took a breath of the cooling evening air, fixed Thomas's pocket watch in his vest, and descended into the mountain one final time. Behind him, unnoticed in the growing darkness, a figure emerged from the rocks where he'd been watching the entire scene. The man's face was weathered and hard. His clothes marked him as mine security, and in his hand was a whistle that could summon a dozen armed men within minutes. But the security guard didn't blow the whistle. Instead, he watched Jacob disappear into the abandoned entrance, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Then he turned and began moving not toward the main mine operations to sound the alarm, but toward Virginia City itself, toward a destination that would complicate the revolution in ways that neither Jacob nor Catherine could have anticipated. The guard's name was Samuel Chen, brother to one of the 40 miners who had just been pulled alive from what should have been their tomb. And he had a debt to pay that was about to shift the balance of power in ways the Vandermeer Empire had never seen coming. The mountain kept its secrets, but it was also choosing its allies, and the revolution was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't explosives or evidence, but loyalty earned through the simple act of giving men back their lives. The sun set completely, plunging the Nevada landscape into darkness. And in that darkness, 3 people moved toward 3 different destinations, each carrying pieces of a plan that would either expose an empire or die trying. The clock was ticking, the water was rising, and in approximately 27 hours, Cornelius Vandermeer would either face justice or drown in the consequences of underestimating how far the dead could reach.